Welcome for our first afternoon panel. My name is Dani Stockman. I'm professor for digital governance at the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin. And as you all know, social media have been recently blamed for causing hate speech, false information, disinformation campaigns, intolerance online and civil discourse, dissatisfaction with political systems. The list goes on and on and on. But in fact, we actually know very little empirically about the relationship between social media and these political consequences. So here on this panel, we will be talking about the political consequences of corporate power in digital markets. And we have two excellent speakers whose empirical research speaks exactly to these points. Our first speaker is Matt Gentzkow, who is professor of economics at Stanford University. And he studies applied microeconomics with a focus on media industries. He has previously held positions at the University of Chicago. His PhD in 2004 is from Harvard University. He has published very widely in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Econometrica, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and others. He has received many awards. The most outstanding one is a 2014 John Bates Clark Medal given by the American Economic Association to the American economist under the age of 40 who has made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Matt Gentzkow to the front. Matt, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, Danny. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to be part of this conference. I want to take the few minutes that I have here really to just show you some facts and a little bit, as Danny said, the impact of social media on democracy is something that we're talking a lot about, but about which evidence and clear facts to guide the discussion are somewhat limited. And so I think lots of us are kind of scrambling to try to get bits and pieces of evidence that we can help sharpen this picture. So I'm going to show you a few of the things that we've been working on recently and a few facts that maybe can help orient this discussion. Before I do that, I think in the context of this conference, there's one thing that I want to say at the beginning, which is in this domain where we're thinking about how these platforms, how social media impacts the political process and democracy, it is less obvious than in the domains we were talking about this morning that concentrated power, lack of competition is the main problem, or is a central part of the problem. Indeed, you might notice that a lot of the discussion around social media and politics has been in various ways people clamoring for, demanding, asking that these platforms exert more power and more control over the content that is circulated on them. And it's not at all clear when we're thinking about the issues associated with problematic content on social media that a world of more fragmented, smaller platforms would in some way be better than a world of concentrated platforms. Indeed, if we think that part of the problem that needs to be solved is these platforms doing a better job of monitoring, regulating the content that they show, it's far from clear that smaller is better than bigger. And so indeed, most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about actually has, despite the title, which relates to the title of this session, is not really about concentration per se. It's about, I think, some pathologies of social media and how they relate to democracy, but they're not specifically about whether there is one big social media platform or two big social media platforms. So I think that's one important thing just to frame this discussion. So I'm going to focus on social media. I think in just setting the stage for that, one of the things that gets very blurred in this discussion is just how important is social media as a source of political news and information today. And I think it clearly is important, and it's clearly important enough that we should be concerned and we should be worried about it. And it is particularly important if we're thinking about, say, younger people. But overall, it remains not the dominant way that people get news and information, and I think is less important than the general discussion sometimes suggests. So this is just, one bit of evidence. If in the US you looked at what people would describe as their most important source of news and information about the election in 2016, the share who said social media is their most important source is about 15%. That's similar to the share of people who say they get news and information from social media often or frequently, which is maybe 20%. And television remained, let's say, circa 2016, the most important source of news. Okay, so two things I'm going to talk about quickly here. First, and these are both trying to think about how is social media relative to other kinds of media that we've had in the past going to change the way political news and information is shared and distributed. I'm going to first talk about what I will call here theory, which actually has no Greek letters in it at all, but is just sort of conceptually how might we have, before we saw social media, what might we have expected from first principles about how this would be the same or different as previous technologies. And then second, I'll talk just quickly about some recent experiments that we've done looking at the impact of Facebook on political news and information. So theory, I think among the first order concerns and the first order mechanisms by which people have in mind that these platforms could be important is that they change the extent to which people are exposed both to broad and diverse range of information, and also to which people self-segregate, and people are going to see conservative content if they're conservatives, liberal content if they're liberals. And there's a whole literature about the fact that if that happens, there are good reasons to think that could be problematic for things like polarization and the functioning of democracies. So question, is social media something we would expect to really exacerbate those kinds of patterns relative to previous sorts of media? And to set the stage for that, I think it's useful to go back 10 years. Jesse Shapiro and I did some work back using data from 2008, looking at to what extent is that true of the old-fashioned internet. So like pre-social media era digital news was also something that many people had claimed was going to lead to this phenomenon of increasing filter bubbles and echo chambers. And so we looked in this paper to what extent that was happening. And the broad conclusion of this paper was less than you might think. So what we tried to do here was construct a measure, I'm not going to go into the details, but of how segregated is consumption, that is, how different is what conservatives and liberals see from each other. How different is that in what people consume digitally? How different is that in things that people consume through traditional media? And also, how different is it in people's non-media social interactions? So are you more or less likely to be looking at the same online news as somebody who has a different viewpoint from yours than you are to, say, meet them in your workplace or in your neighborhood or in your family, or to talk about politics with them face to face? So that was sort of the idea of this paper. And the broad conclusion was the internet actually doesn't look too different, circa 2008, from other news sources. So again, without going into the details of what these measures are, think of this as, on the x-axis here, a measure of how different is what conservatives and liberals see on different media. So these little dots are, this is sort of how conservative is what conservatives see, or the sort of neighborhoods that conservatives are in online, and this is how conservative is the neighborhoods that liberals are online. And the difference between those things is this isolation index, which is a standard measure of segregation. So without any of the details, just looking left to right, you can see the internet looked broadly similar to other media sources, a bit more segregated than cable television, broadcast television, a bit less segregated than national newspapers in the US. If you then also go look at these face-to-face social networks and social interactions, you see that all media are much less segregated than people's actual social networks. So people have much more homogeneous social networks than they do media diets. And there's much more overlap in the media diets that people have than the social networks that they're in. And so you can see it gets, the more we move toward who do you actually talk about politics with, who do you actually trust, those gaps get really big. Okay, so that was kind of the punchline of that paper. And then what we did in the back half of that paper was think about why. What a lot of people had predicted that the internet would look very different. If you believe us, let's just trust me, we're right, that it doesn't look different. Then the question is, why not? What are the forces that mean that segregation is not higher? The basic proposition was like, you would think if something we know that digital markets do is dramatically increase the variety of sources that people have access to. And dramatically increases, in particular, the number of extreme niche kind of sources that people have access to. And so it is not a crazy proposition theoretically to say that could certainly lead to a situation where, because we've increased the sources so much, that makes it easier to self-segregate. Why wasn't that happening online? There were two key things that we said in this paper were the reason why not. The first was something that had always been true of media in the past, including cable television, including broadcast television, including radio, including newspapers going back to the 19th century, is that it is extremely important most people turn to a small number of big brand name sources that they trust. And the way you make money in media markets, the way you're a successful company in a media market, is to develop that kind of brand reputation with consumers for being a source that you trust. And that turned out to be no different online circa 2008. Most consumption of online news is concentrated in big brand name sites. Small number, the top 5 sites accounted for 50% of consumption. The top 20 sites accounted for 85% of consumption. And those were mostly, some were things like Fox and New York Times in the US that have somewhat different, clearly different audiences ideologically, but a lot of them were Yahoo News, MSN, CNN, all of which at that point in time had basically representative audiences in the US. The second is, you say, well, maybe that's true, but what if there are still a bunch of people who, because of all of this choice, are going to segregate themselves in some extreme echo chambers? That could still be really bad, even if 80% of people aren't. 80% of people are just like looking at Yahoo News, but if 20% of people are in these extreme tails, that would still be really bad. That wasn't happening. There are very few people in those extreme tails. Why not? The reason was, if you sort of look at the data, that casual, light internet users, or people who are not super into politics, never find their way to Alex Jones, InfoWars, Breitbart, crazy kind of extreme stuff. The only way that you ever get there is, circa 2008, is if you're a really serious news junkie, political junkie who spends a lot of time online and you're reading little blogs and clicking links and doing stuff like that. So if you look at the audiences of the extreme sites, their audiences are made up overwhelmingly of heavy internet users. And those heavy internet users, because they're online a lot, because they're looking at lots of political content, are also likely to be looking at Fox News, and also likely to be looking at the New York Times, and also likely to be looking at all kinds of other sources as well. So those were that was sort of what we said. This is like fundamental economics that says the internet doesn't actually end up being very different from anything else. So what I want you to think about is, now comes social media. Is social media any different? Is social media going to be another version of, I can stand up here and say, is there like a thing academics enjoy, right? To tell people the thing that you think is so different is not actually very different. We do that all the time. That's kind of like an easy angle to take in lots of these discussions. So question, is that going to be true of social media? Or are there actually fundamental structural differences in social media that make it different. And I actually think in this case, although I do think that the public discussion sometimes exaggerates how important and how different social media is, I think in this case, actually there are fundamental economic differences that you see pretty clearly if you start from the perspective of that 2008 data. So a few things you might notice about social media. First, the whole point of social media is it filters content through your social network. And we just saw that people's social networks are incredibly segregated relative to the kind of content that they see otherwise. So out of the gate, that seems like it's not going to be very good. Second, this doesn't have to be the case on social media, but in practice it is. The way content on social media works, sources are not very salient and important. People don't really notice much what source the individual bits of content they're seeing come from. Rather, they're kind of disembodied little floating bits of content that pretty much are independent of each other. And that means that this whole mechanism of, if people are looking for news, if you have to type a URL into a browser, you're going to go to something you've heard of, that you trust, that you believe in, is going to be much less important here. And incidentally, by the way, the incentives of those platforms to worry, of those publishers or sources to worry about their reputation for reliability and trustworthiness and honesty is going to be a lot smaller as well. If nobody knows that crazy piece of content that everybody clicked on came from me, I don't really pay any penalty if it turns out to be wrong. And then three, really importantly, now the casual, light users who are not that into politics see Alex Jones or see these crazy extreme bits of content. Just empirically, that link where the content, the people seeing the extreme stuff had to be heavy users and political junkies, that's just not true anymore. Because the way this social sharing process works, I can spend no time reading political news, and the thing that comes across my Facebook feed is some very obscure bit of content from some quite extreme source. So those are all reasons why we might think that this would be different. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that at least in this echo chamber segregation kind of sense, it is pretty different. There are various data points. One is this nice paper that many people know by Aytan Bakshi, Solomon Messing, and Lada Adamek, who are all data scientists at Facebook. And just if you actually the point of their paper, if you read it, is don't worry, Facebook doesn't have echo chambers. But if you look at the data in their paper, actually it shows that Facebook is quite a bit, has a much higher level of segregation than other news sources. So this is just, the way they do this is they take a bunch of content, they classify it based on focusing on users who at that time on Facebook had self-reported political ideologies. People could say in their Facebook profile, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. Take people who give a political ideology and ask, what is the average political ideology of people who share this bit of content? That's what's on the x-axis here. This means it's the average person who shares it is conservative, the average person who shares it is liberal. If you sort of made the analogous plot for the websites we were looking at in 2008, it looks like a unimodal distribution. And you see here on Facebook, it looks very bimodal. And if you kind of crank that through the same isolation index, you have to make some assumptions because we don't have all of the data from their paper that we need to do this, but under some assumptions, you're going to get that the content of Facebook is somewhere out here more segregated ideologically than any of these other things. So bottom line, it is not the case that digital media per se needs to be bad for democracy in this sense, but I think there are structural features of social platforms that make them likely to do so, and indeed are kind of pushing in that direction. Okay. The other thing to talk about just quickly in the last few minutes is, that's all sort of theory in quotes, like what might happen. Doesn't actually say anything about the impact of any of that on people. So I just wanted to summarize an experiment that we did recently, trying to get closer to measuring the actual political impacts of social media on people. So this is joint work with Hunt Alcott, Luca Braghieri, Sarah Eichmeyer. And it was an experiment we did in October to December 2018, basically in the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections in the US. And it's super simple in some sense. We just took a bunch of people, sample of like a few thousand people, and then we randomized some of them to deactivate their Facebook accounts for a month. Control group didn't deactivate their Facebook accounts for a month. So this treatment group is going to take this like month-long Facebook detox, where like your account is turned off, you can't use it, and then see what happens. And I'm not going to talk about all these different outcomes, but this experiment had the nature that once you're doing all the work to set this up, like there's a bunch of things we're worried about Facebook affecting, so we're going to try to measure sort of as many as we can. So there's a whole part of this paper which is about effects on individuals, things like well-being and happiness. Is there evidence of things like addiction related to Facebook? But the one I want to focus on today is we can also measure how being on or off Facebook in the run-up to an election impacts how much people know about what's going on. Do they know real facts? Are they persuaded of fake news and misinformation? And also how polarized they are politically. So that's what we try to do in this experiment. This was the timeline. We recruit people in September. The key experimental period where people's accounts are deactivated runs from October 11th to November 8th. This was like right after the election. And then we have a follow-up survey where we can measure things like how did people's demand for Facebook post-experiment change if they had this month-long detox. We recruited people on Facebook using ads on Facebook. I won't talk about that. That turns out to be a good place if you're looking for Facebook users. Facebook ads turns out to be a good way to find them. Deactivation, just to have in mind, this is easy to do. You can turn your account off temporarily. If you then come back and turn it on, all of your friends are still there, all of your content is still there. You don't lose any of that stuff, which is what makes it kind of reasonable for us to get people to do this. And also, in ways I won't tell you about, we can monitor whether your account is on or off quite well. So we can pay people and confirm that they actually did shut down their account, and they basically can't cheat. Let me not go through the sample size except to say there's basically about 3,000 people in the experiment. And so here are those results quickly. Okay, so the first question before we get to the political effects was just, how do people substitute their time? So the average person in this experiment is using Facebook for 60 minutes a day prior to the experiment. So you turn off your Facebook account, we give you back 60 minutes a day. What are people going to do with that time? That's really important for these political effects we're talking about, because if what they're going to do is go read really high-quality news sources, that might be really good for democracy. If what they're going to do instead is not that, it might have a very different effect. And so you might ask in general, how much of the substitution is toward other social media, is toward other digital things, or is toward maybe like quality face-to-face interactions with your family and friends? Something. And what we see, which is quite striking, is actually not only do other social media use and other digital things not go up, they actually go down. So Facebook is a substitute, is a complement, not a substitute, for all other digital things, including other social media, but also reading news apps on your phone, watching YouTube videos, everything else. One way to think about that is just, if you're not on Facebook, you're not taking out your phone all the time. It's like a plausible mechanism. So everything digital goes down, basically, and everything not digital goes up. We also look at news specifically, and basically, people, when they're off of Facebook, are getting less news from Facebook or other social media, and there's no change in news consumption anywhere else. So we don't see any evidence that people are substituting. So the two then main results. One, how does this affect news knowledge? Do we give people like factual quizzes about facts, factual quizzes about news events during that month in this run-up to the election, see how well informed are people. And here the result is quite strong. This is sort of an overall index. This is this like news knowledge quiz questions. People, when they're off of Facebook, are less informed about the world. They know less about politics by a variety of different measures. We try to measure whether they're persuaded of fake news, misinformation that circulated widely during that month, and there's no, the power is limited, but we find no effects. Okay? So people are actually more, social media is making people more informed. It is also making them more polarized. So across a variety of measures, which I don't have time to talk about, political polarization is substantially lower when people are off of Facebook. In the treatment group, this index of political polarization, which includes things like how far apart and extreme are people's views on issues like police treatment of minorities, immigration, trade, stuff that were hot button issues in that period. So polarization goes down. So I'll conclude then, the bottom line is, on this set of outcomes, is in some sense a double-edged sword if we're thinking about democracy. Social media is in fact making people more informed, and I think this is a really important thing that often gets lost in this debate. The predominant fact about news consumption in the United States, at least, and also in a lot of Europe, is that most people don't get any news at all. Most people get very little. We talk all the time about cable news and Fox and CNN and all that stuff. The share of Americans who watch any substantial amount of cable news is maybe 20%, 15%. Most people don't get much news at all. Something that Facebook does for sure is take a bunch of those not very politically engaged people and expose them to some political news and information, which you can see has this effect. But it also is making them more polarized. Is that better or worse for democracy? That's a tough question. Would we rather have a society where nobody knows what's going on, but they're also not mad at each other? Or would we rather have a society where people are informed and engaged and also have a little more animosity? And I think that's a tough call. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Matt. And our next speaker is Helen Margetts, who is Professor of Society and the Internet at the University of Oxford. She is also now the Director of the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. From 2011 to 2018, Helen was Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. Many of you will know about it. She has published numerous articles and 6 books. Her most recent book, that she will also be talking about today a little bit, is Political Turbulence: How Social Media Shape Collective Action, which won the Political Studies Association's McKinsey Prize of the Political Studies Association for Best Politics Book in 2017. In 2019, she was awarded an OBE in the Queen's New Year's Honors List for services to social and political science. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela, and it's very nice to be here. So I am a self-declared political scientist, as Daniel said, so in a different tribe from quite a lot of you, so please forgive me for that, but I hope we can still communicate. I'm interested in the relationship, and I've always been interested in the relationship between technology and politics. And obviously, the technological development, it gets more and more interesting. It used to be quite a sad and lonely thing to do, to think about the relationship between technology and government, for example. Absolutely nobody interested in it when I started. But now, increasingly, and especially with artificial intelligence, everybody has started being interested, so that's good. And one thing I'm particularly interested in with regard to social media is this question that somehow we can have these 2 concurrent views about the relationship between social media and politics. And certainly in the British in British political culture, these are both very strong. One of them is that social media doesn't make any difference. The kind of politics that you do with social media is not really important. It doesn't have enough costs. It doesn't involve long meetings or tramping down the streets, knocking on doors. It doesn't hurt in any way. It's not costly enough, and it's been derided as clicktivism and slacktivism. And then the other view, as Daniela said, and Matt also referred to, social media are to blame for absolutely everything. Populism, extremism, rise of the far right, violence, radicalization, Trump, Brexit, of course, and rather unlikely leaders of traditional political parties, of which we have a few in the UK. So I'm interested in exploring those, and the idea of the book, Political Turbulence, was really to kind of get in the middle there and try and understand what's going on, because as Matt said and other people have said, the evidence base is really shaky. So we undoubtedly do, as we've been hearing about, spend a lot of our lives on social media and other digital platforms. And that leads me to the kind of first difference that I believe is going on here, and that's it's possible to do a really little bit of politics. Politics used to be very lumpy. You had to join a party or do something really quite significant to do any politics at all. There's no pre-social media equivalent to liking something or sharing something or following somebody. And evidence is, for example, that people share more than they read. I mean, sharing a piece of political news could be designated a political act. And if you're willing to buy into that argument, that sort of very little bits of politics become possible, another important thing is, as several of the speakers have mentioned, that when you're on social media, first of all, you're having these kind of possibilities for little bits of politics thrust at you. And also, you're being given far more social information about what other people are doing than we used to have. Social media are full of it. How many people like something? How many people follow somebody? What's trending? What's hot? What's not? Etc. And we know from decades of social science research that that influences behavior. And a lot of our models actually are based on the idea that we know how many other people are doing something. But the fact is that in a pre-social media world, we really didn't. If you sign a petition in the street, you don't know how many other people have done it. Although, of course, the organizers will tell you that it was a great many. You just don't know. So we live in much more kind of social information-rich environments than we did before. And that exerts influence. So going back to the idea of these tiny acts, one thing that we have seen, and I don't think there isn't a country in the world that hasn't seen something like the images here. The idea that photographs, that's a football stadium in Germany, that images of refugee crises and other political crises spread all over social media haven't sort of changed the course of action for some people and have had an effect on outcomes. The Me Too movement, born literally out of a hashtag. Podemos, just one example of a political party that's sort of grown out of a social media mobilization. And then these kind of waves of support come for unlikely political figures that seem to come almost from nowhere. You could argue that these kind of chains of reaction, tiny acts of participation, each one of those tiny acts sending a signal of viability to everybody else. Look, everyone has started to like this guy. Everyone has started to do this. People are being brave enough to come out and say this. Every single like and share is some tiny signal of viability. We've seen a sort of rise in political participation among groups that we have been despairing for years, as political scientists anyway, that they just don't engage, not interested in politics. Take school children campaigning for gun controls in the US. Did we think we'd see it? That's we haven't talked about Snapchat, but that's a map on Snapchat. So just to follow Matt in saying something positive for a moment, I know it's not fashionable in this space, but we are seeing extensive interest and engagement among groups where we thought such a possibility did not exist. So there is a sense, and the evidence about people being more politically informed if they lose social media is part of that, perhaps. That it is some kind of or could lead to some sort of democratic renewal. But it leads to other things too. And there's an important thing to say about mobilizations that take place on social media. And that is that they're extremely unpredictable. They happen very quickly. These are petitions to the UK government website that got more than 10,000 signatures. So these are the successful ones. They're going up incredibly quickly in a very short space of time with a very few exceptions. But this is most mobilizations. This is kind of most tweets and most Facebook posts. Most things aren't shared. Most things go nowhere. 99.95% of petitions don't achieve that number of signatures. So there's a very small proportion of such mobilizations that do actually succeed. And another point to note is that the decay rate is also incredibly fast. What this model shows is that, and this is US and UK data for a complete data set of petitions to the UK and US government platforms over 5 years, that if a petition hasn't made it in 10 hours, it's probably not going anywhere. Probably better to start again. So all of that introduces a sort of a volatility, an instability, and an unpredictability about this sort of political mobilization. The same sort of instability that has been identified by many scholars in cultural markets. And I think the singer Ed Sheeran, for example, is such a good example of this phenomenon. Someone who the song The Shape of You has received over 1 billion streams on Spotify alone, or that was a year ago, so God knows what it is now. Does that mean that he's the best singer ever? I don't want to make musical judgments at a conference like this, but possibly not. He looks like the boy next door, right? Well, could he be the boy next door? Is there a certain sort of randomness in the selection of the things that succeed versus the things that don't? Are we seeing that sort of Ed Sheeran effect in political worlds? And that's what we try to understand in the book of Political Turbulence, and that's what we argued. It's actually, though, quite difficult to measure political volatility. I'd really like to show you a neat graph now that shows that exactly. It shows you that social media have brought volatility to politics. Maybe in 5 years' time I'll be able to do that. At the moment, however, it is quite complicated to measure political volatility. We are starting to develop what we think are new ways of doing that. There is some evidence that the number of issues that political systems, the number of policy issues that political systems are able to accommodate is increasing. That's perhaps one measure that you might make of volatility. This is UK public opinion responses to what's the most important issue facing the country today. In the UK, there's a little bit of evidence there. I mean, just visually, it looks like that's going up, although obviously that's not the right way to measure it. We have to use other methods. And if we try and measure the difference between agendas, if we try and somehow encapsulate the novelty of the agenda, this is something that we've been trying to do with news media. This is actually Der Spiegel. From the running from the 1950s to 2015, measuring the 10th week versus the 20th week, the distribution of topics. We use topic modeling to do this between those 2 weeks in the year over time since 1950, indicating we've actually chosen Germany as a case study country because we kind of imagined it was going to be more stable than the UK. Just about anywhere is more stable than the UK at the moment, really. But that was our idea. But actually what this suggests that actually novelty seems to be growing. There is some beginnings of evidence for some increase in volatility there. But working out the relationship between that increase in volatility and the kind of volatility that we're observing on social media is actually a really difficult thing to do. And we might ask ourselves whether the social, I think it's an open question, an important question, whether the volatility on social media actually pulls public opinion and the other domains that we're looking at here, like the media domain, away from the kind of activity taking place on social media. which could, by the way, if any of the older members of the audience think they recognise that image, it's probably that it reminded you of, but you have to be over a certain age to get it. Anyway, there definitely seems to be an increasing levels of volatility in political systems, and social media seem to be implicated somewhere in that. That's good news for political scientists and politics professors in universities, because everybody's more interested in politics than they used to be. But it also leads me to talk a moment about the social media pathologies that both Matt and Daniela have mentioned. And we know to some extent that all these things exist. We know that there are all sorts of incentives in the markets of social media platforms for misinformation and disinformation, new incentives that weren't there before, and less control over what information is out there on platforms. We know, and one of the many reasons I liked Matt's presentation so much, that there is that social media can replicate the kind of echo chambers that we adopt in our everyday lives. And there is evidence for that we replicate the kind of social media, the kind of echo chambers and filter bubbles that we exist in offline, and we replicate those on social networks. We know that political parties and political campaigners are spending huge quantities of money on targeted, personalized advertising in a way that wasn't possible before. We know that there's huge amounts of computational propaganda and bots, and we know that there's been a rise in hate speech, and that is a growing phenomenon. But we know amazingly little more than that, if you see what I mean. We don't know that much about the scale and scope of hate speech, for example. We have a big project looking at how to measure hate speech at the Alan Turing Institute. And we're finding, although there have been a huge amount of projects in this area, it's a little bit like telemedicine was in the 1990s. Lots and lots of pilot systems and tools and classifiers, but not much understanding of the overall scale and scope of hate speech. And most crucially, what the effect is. Because after all, this is the thing that we really don't know. An echo chamber that reinforces the views of the people in the echo chamber is not necessarily having an effect on an election result, for example. It's preaching to the converted. How much of any kind of filter bubble is just preaching to the converted? What kind of effect do the huge volumes of computational propaganda have? And what effect does hate speech? It may be that hate speech, which after all is grown from exactly the same phenomena as I was talking about before, it's easier to do a little bit of hate. It may be that phenomenon is kind of the real threat here. I mean, some people believe that a whole generation of women may be put off public life because of what they see other women being exposed to. And although we know so little about what proportion of social media content is hate speech, we do know, or we're beginning to know, that probably around a quarter, at least in Britain, of people have seen some kind of hateful content on social media. That's the preliminary results from the latest Oxford Internet Survey. So that is a very worrying phenomenon, and one that we really need to study. But having said all that, there's no doubt that there is a lot of institutional catching up to do. It's not surprising. Social media platforms have only been intertwined with political life for less than 10 years, really, if you think about it. But there's all sorts of things that have sort of started happening but need to happen more. Some of them have been mentioned. One of them is the issue of public service journalism and fact-checking, and the possibility of introducing financial incentives for public service journalism. We were talking about that before. Some of the platform changes that have taken place. Facebook now has a transparency report, for example, and took down over 500 million fake accounts in the first quarter of last year. At least they're doing that, and we know that, but it does indicate some sort of scale of the problem. Advertising transparency and spending controls. I do believe that in the UK, for example, we've had the phenomenon of the unofficial Leave.eu campaign that campaigned unofficially to leave the European Union in 2016. That organisation has been pumping out advertisements, targeted advertisements on social media for 3 years since the referendum, and segued effortlessly into being the Brexit party that did so well in the recent European elections. To what extent was that scrutinised or regulated or controlled? I think that's a really important question for the Electoral Commission and other regulators. That all regulators now need expertise in technology and AI platforms. And certainly in a UK setting, organisations like the Electoral System, the Electoral Commission, are not set up to cope with that kind of political environment. As I said, it's not surprising that we haven't had this institutionalization yet. I've just spent a month in Washington earlier this year and was very struck by the words of Thomas Jefferson on the Jefferson Memorial. And I think, obviously, he didn't experience Snapchat, but I think if he had, he would definitely have had something to say along those lines. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
At this point, I would like to invite both of the speakers up to the front so that we can start our discussion. Oh, yeah, maybe I can. Thank you. So before I open up the discussion to everybody else, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about how to deal with these issues, because I think your talks have made very clear that we have made some advancement regarding our empirical understandings of the political consequences of social media, but you already also very clearly point out that we have a long way to go and that we need more empirical work. Nevertheless, at the moment, at least in Europe, political decision makers are making policy decisions in order to deal with these issues. In Germany, since 2018, we have NetzDG that is, in my opinion, leading to large social media companies to remove a large amount of content in order to preempt fines. In France, currently, there are debates about about a similar law, about how to deal with these issues at the European level. There are discussions. Maybe, Helen, you can also talk a little bit about what the discussion is in the UK regarding this. And so I was wondering, Matt, one way to read or to interpret your conclusion would be, given that Facebook actually helps people to become more informed about politics, actually we haven't given enough credit to Facebook yet. I mean, there's research by Phil Converse that has been replicated in many other contexts, not only in the United States, showing that publics in democracies tend to be not knowledgeable about politics, so maybe Facebook has been helping us. Or has a positive effect, but then at the same time, you also, your research shows that there is a polarization effect that may be related to the product itself. So if I understand the argument correctly, then polarization would be caused by the very fact that it is a social network and that people's social networks are just not diverse, but instead uniform. So maybe there is a problem with the product itself. So my question to you would be, can it be regulated? Or is there something more fundamental going on? And then for Helen, my question would be, you ended the talk talking about these, greater institutionalization. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what kind of institutionalization you think would be helpful in this context, because even, now we're moving to sort of from self-regulating these companies towards co-regulating these companies, and companies like Facebook are even calling to be for oversight bodies in order to be regulated, and I guess in the previous period under self-regulation, these companies also institutionalized certain structures in order to moderate content and so forth. But I think the kinds of institutionalization that you have in mind is more at the administrative, sort of public level. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about what kind of institutionalization you think would be helpful. I know we don't have answers yet, but because this is such a topical issue, I would really appreciate your thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah, I think exactly as you said, my view of this is that a lot of the problem is just social networks as a source of political news and information per se. Not Facebook's platform particularly, not the way Facebook is regulated, but it's just some features inherent to if the way we're going to decide what I see is what my friends choose to share at some level. So I think that the solution to these problems that I am most optimistic about is that we should have social media not be the dominant place that people get news and information in the future. And I think some people have in mind that it's sort of inevitable that that's where we're going. 18% of people, 14% of people said social media was their most important source of news in 2016. That'll be up to 50 by 2020 and 90 by 2024. I think that's not at all obvious or inevitable. I think the share of people today, trust in information on social media has plummeted. The share of people who say they trust information they get on social media a lot is, at least in some survey, like 4%. There's lots of innovation of other platforms, but like Apple News Apple has been innovating a lot on their news platform. There are lots of other human-curated platforms for news that work better. So I think that's one thing. Second, I think within the confines of a social network, there are certainly dials that these platforms can turn that make things better or worse. So, another one of the things I said was part of the story here was having sources not be very salient and privileging a pretty diffuse set of content. Those are both things that they can control. And indeed, Facebook has one of the key changes that they have made over time has been dialing up and up and up the emphasis on what source things come from. So, and I think they could keep doing that. Those are solutions that don't necessarily have anything to do with regulation. I am, maybe in a minority in this room, very cautious about government regulation of content. That's something that I have real unease with, and I think there's a lot of historical reasons to have unease with that. I think it's just a good thought experiment for everybody in the US who's clamoring for more government regulation of content, regulating what's true and what's false, what's hate and what's not, what can be said and what can't be said. Are you sure you want more government regulation of that where the government is the government that we have today? Because that's, like everybody loves government regulation of content when they agree with the government. The whole point of the laws and institutions and structures that we have that dramatically curtail that in the US is the worry that you've got to remember what happens when it's the current administration that you don't like that's the one deciding what gets seen. So I'm cautious about that, and I think there's lots of scope for more regulation of these platforms around the kind of competition policy issues we were talking about this morning, around privacy, but I think that the content issues that we're talking about, there may be some scope for regulation and liability around the edges, but basically the solution is not going to be government regulation, but rather is going to have to come from the private sector itself. I would say, by the way, you mentioned, maybe Facebook doesn't get enough credit. I think that's true in some sense. Like Facebook doesn't get much credit for anything these days, but I actually think that where a lot of the positive push and the improvement is going to come from is exactly the kind of public pressure that these companies are under. So that has been incredibly powerful. They have, this is not, it's not a case where like their advertising revenue keeps going up and they don't care, this stuff doesn't affect them at all. It affects them tremendously, and I think this public scrutiny and public pressure, journalists, highlighting all of the ways that they're screwing up has been extremely productive, and that's something we need more of.
Yeah, I mean, I do think with Facebook that there should be a sort of easy win for politics here. Most people prefer doing things which aren't politics. Most of the things we were talking about this morning aren't politics. It's a small part. If you were threatening the business model in some way, but you could regulate some aspects of political activity on Facebook without threatening that. And it's done them so much reputational damage out of all proportion to kind of the revenue that they make from it that I think they would be willing. So I think there is a possibility of a kind of regulation which is actually a kind of working together because I think, as you say, they've actually asked for it. Some of the things, though, can, as you say, come from public pressure and also journalistic pressure. The point about public service journalism, I think, is important. I mean, I actually think that the Cambridge Analytica scandal, of course, it was a scandal, but it was interesting that there were so many bad actors involved in that, and Facebook carried the can for all of them, really. Got a highly disproportionate share. I mean, the head of Cambridge Analytica is back speaking on the conference circuit now. That's how rehabilitated they are. But one good thing about it was it did create this kind of big public pressure, and there is a lot of public pressure on them for to change. But I think you could open up channels perhaps for greater public pressure if there was more transparency, if you kind of if you could somehow mandate more transparency, because it still is quite a murky kind of, they've done lots of good things, but lots of people don't know about them. And even the trusted sources thing was introduced very kind of quietly and everything. Opening up channels with the people who use the platform is something that I think is important for Facebook. And the other thing where I think that government and regulators might actually step in is this question of data sharing, which we talked a bit about, which Fiona talked about this morning. I mean, you can't, I think it would be almost impossible to regulate Facebook in the current data environment, given how difficult it is to get data from the platform. And other platforms, of course, well, I mean, the ones that they own are worse, but then there's things like Snapchat, which are worse still. And I think we have got to develop methods for obtaining secure, anonymized data, and for regulators to be able to do that. They do have some powers. Some regulators have some powers, but they're not used to their maximum, and they could be greater. I don't know if anybody here is involved in the Social Science One initiative. Yeah, you're involved in that. So, I mean, again, they are trying to open up data through, Facebook are trying to open up data through the Social Science One initiative, working with the Social Sciences Research Council. But that's definitely a direction which I think has got to be developed.
Thank you. So at this point, I would like to open up the discussion. Please, can you please make sure that you have a microphone so that everybody can hear you, and also mention your name and your affiliation to introduce yourself. Thank you. So there's somebody coming.
Hi, Really, really interesting talks. I was just wondering...
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Amelia Fletcher. I'm speaking in the next section. I'm at University of East Anglia. But one of the things I was thinking about is when you talk about reputation as a constraint on the behaviour of the platforms, obviously people were very upset about Cambridge Analytica and various other things, but then Facebook own WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook, and so people leave for a little while. I mean, I've not seen the figures on this, but I suspect people deactivate for a while, and they don't intend to go back. And
they
after
didn't
a while,
much actually.
Okay, but
the usage didn't really go down.
So the question, so that may be the answer to the question. The question was, at the moment, there's not a huge amount of choices for consumers where all their friends are. If there were more options for consumers, so if there was more competition in social media, do you think that would help with the political issues that you're highlighting, or could it actually have negative consequences? And in that context, when you think about media plurality rules in mergers, when we think about a merger between newspapers, we say, is this going to have a harm to media plurality? Should we be thinking of platform plurality rules and the news implications of that when we think about social media mergers?
Yeah, I mean, I think more competition for Facebook would be great. I think if we could rewind the clock and undo the WhatsApp and Instagram mergers, we would do that for sure. I think that would be great, mainly from my perspective, because of the ways in which it would have benefits through the broader competition policy kind of channels. I think your question is competition going to be good or bad for the democracy side of this is a really important question, and I think this is a domain where it's particularly important to remember all of the ambiguities in theory about when is competition going to be good or going to be bad. A simple way to think about that I have found helpful in thinking about media markets is, in some very loose sense, what competition is going to do is going to tend to push firms toward giving consumers more of what they want. And so if the problems that we're worried about are mainly something like, in the media context, for example, the main thing we have been worried about historically is capture of media by governments, capture of media by corporate owners. So if the main problem is the media are not telling important information to consumers, which the consumers would really like to have, like there's some scandal going on in government or some corruption that needs to be exposed. Consumers really want to hear that, but the government would like to hide it. Competition is going to tend to be great, because that's more transparency is what consumers want. If the problem is mainly coming from the demand of consumers themselves, say for like-minded information, as an example, then or sensationalist content, or then it is much less obvious that competition is going to be beneficial. And it's not obvious that it won't, but I think it's a much tougher, more delicate case, what kind of outcomes we would have under more competition. I think, frankly, in this particular case, you could have had any market configuration you want, and these problems would have looked pretty similar. I mean, the basic problem is that we've suddenly have this infrastructure that happens to be controlled by Facebook, could be controlled by whoever you want, where incredible volumes of information can now move at much faster speeds than they ever could before, and nobody is able to watch all of that and keep track of it and think of it carefully and police it. And that basic problem of like, how do you govern content in these massive platforms, my guess is would have been similar anyway.
Yes, please.
Paul Niemetz, I would like to ask you about this study which came from Warwick University, end of 2017, Carsten Müller and Carlo Schwarz, Flaming the Flames of Hate, Social Media and Hate Crime. And they claim that they have empirical evidence that right-wing anti-refugee sentiment on Facebook predicts violent crime against refugees in municipalities with higher social media usage. To establish causality, they exploit exogenous variations in major internet and Facebook outages, which fully undo the correlation between social media and hate crime. So basically what they're saying is, they have proven that in the communities in East Germany where we had a lot of violent incidents against refugees, there was at the same time a very high usage intensity of Facebook. So, you know, just a question on the causality. Is there anything similar in America, these studies? I mean, it would be logical to look in the towns where you have Charlottesville and so on. Has anything like that been tried and done? I think it's a very important question, because indeed, one of the top arguments of Facebook and Google whenever you try to regulate hate speech and violence-inducing speech is you have no proof of causality, which in Europe, of course, is a real tragedy, because by coincidence, you know, with the rise of internet, we have a rise of political violence in Europe, anti-Semitic political violence, anti-Muslim by around 400%. That empirics is pretty clear.
I haven't seen the study. Have you seen the study?
Yeah, I think it's a great paper, and it's an important topic. And I also agree with you that establishing causality in these contexts is extremely hard. In that paper included, I think proves is too strong a word. I think that paper provides some provocative evidence for that. So I think for sure, I don't know of a similar study on hate crimes in the US. I think that we do need more of that kind of research. And I also think the hypothesis of that study is one I strongly suspect is correct. And it speaks to another piece of this that I think is really important, which is you can think of two kinds of effects of something like social media. One, which is the kind of thing we often end up measuring, is how is this going to affect something like the average voter? How is it going to, what are the kind of broad effects on most of the distribution? And that would be something like what we measure in this paper, you know, what is the average effect of Facebook on polarization? There's then something very different, which is what are the kind of tail extreme events that these platforms might enable? Like, for example, does social media help people coordinate terrorist attacks? And you know, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of the Facebook population. So in aggregate, we wouldn't say that's a big part of Facebook's average effect, but the costs when it happened can be enormous. And I mean, it's another one of the things that just the fundamental structure of social media is very good for, is connecting people who have unusual beliefs or views with each other. And that is the basis of a lot of the great effects of social media. If I am a parent who has a child who has a rare disease living in some small city in the US, I can find other parents around the country who are struggling with the same thing and connect with them. We have great evidence in Russia, for example, that social media does have a clearly identified causal impact on the incidence of political protests, political activism. And so if you live in a country with an authoritarian government, it remains right that by finding other people, you can, but it's exactly that same phenomenon. That means if instead of the unusual thing about me being that I am a parent with a child with this disease, the unusual thing about me is that I hate black people, hopefully unusual, or that I want to blow something up, it has that effect too. And so my guess is that those kind of tail event impacts are likely especially important in this case.
But in general, any sort of experiment, whether it be the type that Matt did or a natural experiment like that, I mean, we have to have more experimental research in this area because, as I said, the evidence base is so poor.
This is Fiona Scott-Morton. I was on the panel this morning. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of a contradiction that I'm hearing from the panel about regulation. So Matt is against regulation and prefers that firms regulate themselves. So
and
then
against
we
regulation
ask
of the
ourselves,
content.
why would they do that? And the answer to that is public pressure. So they want to maximize profit, and once the public realizes what's going on, then it's in the interest of the firm to respond to that. How does the public know what's going on? Here's where we get a little circular. There was a government investigation in Britain that brought us a lot of the information about what was going on. So the implicit threat of regulation is a reason why we get public pressure. And again, Helen said, let's mandate transparency so that the public knows whether they should be exerting public pressure. Well, mandating transparency sounds to me like a regulation. So I feel a little bit like you can hold the position that in the end, the equilibrium you most prefer is the one without regulation. But if there isn't a threat and movement toward actually doing something by way of regulation on the part of the government, we're not going to get to the better equilibrium in the first place.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you, basically. I mean, yeah, I'm not scared to say regulation, although I know that doesn't go down well with Silicon Valley audiences. But in Europe, you can say, well, we had GDPR and the sky didn't fall in, you know, and some things happened that they wouldn't otherwise have happened. And yeah, so I mean, I'm agreeing with you basically.
I don't think I disagree with you either. I'm certainly not against regulation. And I'm certainly not against some sensible regulation around transparency. I think, for example, a rule that says political advertising all has to be disclosed in a database and accessible makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Rules that make more of the content transparent, I think, make a ton of sense. I think there is a tension between saying we want to have rules that mandate a lot of data sharing and transparency and concerns about privacy. So I think if we sort of have this idea like firms should be mandated to share data with new entrants to allow them to come into the market and see who my friends are and so on, so they can also create a social network. You know, the privacy challenges are difficult there. You can de-anonymize data, but then it becomes less useful to somebody building a rival social network and so on. So I think there are challenges how to do it right, but I think transparency, you know, we regulated political content on television and advertising on television in the US, political advertising in other media in the US. We have done that for a long time. I thought that was a good idea. I think we should keep doing it. I'm not sure I agree with the characterization of the facts about, you know, most of what we know about the problematic things on Facebook have been revealed by journalists, but some government investigations have been useful. The thing I am wary of in particular is regulation specifically over things like what is true and false and content. I think what we're talking about is externalities. When there are externalities, leaving firms to take care of themselves is usually tricky. If it's pollution, regulation works well because everybody agrees that we want less pollution. If you have something where half of the people think we want more of it and half of the people think that we want less of it, then the political solution becomes hard.
Yes, please.
Right, so to stay exactly on this point, right? So I understand the difficulty of deciding what is good or bad, but Helen was mentioning the problem of fake news, the problem or the fact that some troll campaigns from Russia spread information that is not true, right? So I know that it's difficult to define what is true and what is not true. So if I take the results from your papers and put these two things together, so if you say people are more informed, but the quality of the information that they get is worse, right? So it might be worse because you have the fake news, because you have the trolls spreading information that is not true, then the positive effect might be overturned by this negative effect. And then going back to Fiona's point, so it's not exactly that what we want to regulate, to have the positive effect that people get informed, because they would not read the New York Times, but then you don't have the negative effect of a lot of dispersion because you have this extreme news. So I don't know, how is your view on this?
Well, I do think that the trusted source thing, for example, was a good move on Facebook's part. And I do think that can have a positive effect. Where it gets difficult, though, is the question of hate. I mean, hate is both difficult to define in social science terms and difficult to deal with in technical terms. I mean, Facebook reckon they catch about half of it. And on top of that, all the platforms have been incredibly slow to deal with hateful content. And I think it's debatable. You know, I think that is a serious question, and we have to think about how that could have happened more quickly and how it should stop. Tommy Robinson, for example, who is a really reprehensible figure in the UK, has only just been taken down from Facebook, and you know, you can't see any rule or norm or principle or whatever that hadn't been broken, and yet was still there, presumably because it had so many followers. So I think we have got to, whatever else we do, we have to find out a way of dealing with that, and it's got to be it would have to be multi-stakeholder. It would have to be Facebook acting, but it has to, I think there has to be some sort of regulation as well, because it isn't happening without. And you know, people's lives get lost, and you know, you can't just leave it and hope that they've learnt their lesson, because it's too long now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, my view of the whole fake news, misinformation part of this conversation is that it's been mostly a giant distraction, and that it's a distraction that we've really latched onto precisely because if what we're talking about is stories about Hillary Clinton abusing children in the basement of a pizza parlor, suddenly all of these difficult ambiguities aren't there so much. Like, we can agree, there are few people who would make the case that we want more of that kind of content. But I think there's now a whole body of studies showing that the importance of that, if you take the stuff that we talk about all the time in this fake news discussion, which are the things which are just clearly, unambiguously absurd, false stories. The Pope endorsed Donald Trump, you know, these sorts of things, they're just very small. And they're the tip of a much, much, much bigger iceberg. The stuff that matters for polarization, the stuff that matters is not, you could get rid of all that stuff and it would not make much of a difference, because most of what people are seeing is not black and white, categorically, obviously false, and it is also not sent by Russians, but it's like all of the rest of the content, which is framed, selected, presented in ways that, while it's probably not strictly speaking false, or at least it's walking some gray line, it nevertheless has big impacts on people's views. And so, I mean, I would have no problem if tomorrow we want to pass some law that says Russians may not advertise in US elections, fine. If you can think of a way to define a law that outlaws Pizzagate stories, fine. I don't think that would be super problematic if we could do it well. I also don't think it would help, because I think the impact of that stuff is actually quite small. The problematic effects, and this has always been true in media, that media content, media bias has a profound impact in society and democracy, and mostly it is not because of things that are black and white false. It's because of the contested space in between, where there's stuff that some people look at and say is balanced, fair, and objective, and other people look at and say is ridiculously distorted and wrong. And that's what I think is challenging to get in the middle of and legislate where to draw the lines.
Yeah, I think it would be important to focus. I mean, like personalized, targeted political advertising, kind of between election campaigns as well as during election campaigns. You know, that's the thing which is challenging our whole system for regulating elections. If you can sort that out, a lot of this other stuff will probably fall by the wayside as part of that process.
So, Özlem Bedredefuli from ESMT Berlin. I have a question exactly on this point of fake news. I agree that media bias has been around quite a long time, but I think the key difference for social media is not, Facebook is not meant to be the source of access to news. It was meant to be sharing whatever content with my friends and family and, you know, my social circle. And then it turned out to be the source of information for many people. And I think here is the critical difference from standard media corporations, which have had responsibility to check source of information that they were delivering. By regulation, any news corporation needs to check the source of information. Whether they do it in the right way or not, this is something like, you know, implementation of this news rules. But nobody has asked, or should we ask Facebook to check the source of the information that someone is sharing via their social circles? If we ask Facebook to do so, how can we trust Facebook to say that this is trusted source? So at the end of the day, Facebook is also a private organization. So my question is very now, not only being private, but also it's a monopoly in the social media. It's very challenging to, first of all, expect Facebook to invest all this amount of time and effort to check the source of information for anything shared on the social media. And the second thing, whether we can trust Facebook that what is shown is really tested or trusted. So how can we implement this type of, you know, if we let Facebook to regulate itself, how can we implement this in practical terms?
We can't expect them to check everything on the platform to see if it's true. No, I mean, no, I would agree with you. We might aspire to check everything that was hateful, though. So that is something that we could do. But the question of whether things are true or not, no. I mean, but the trusted sources are only applied to news items, right? I mean, that is something that they've done. They have invested a lot of effort. They have consulted. They have done it in a sort of modest and incremental way. So I think that is an example of the kind of thing that you can do. It's not going to solve the whole problem, but it is something that has directly been kind of used to tackle the question of actual news items which purport to be news items and are something else. So it is a start, and I don't know that they really have any incentive to get it wrong, as it were, because this precise point has caused them so much reputational damage. I mean, it is a problem that you would have. I mean, if we had a lot more platforms, then I think we have this problem with all of them. The average teenager is active on 5 social media platforms, 2 of which their parents have heard of. You know, there is a question here about what they are, what information they are communicating, and whether it's right or not, and what kind of nudges and framing the platforms give, which vary enormously. And we know about Facebook, and we all know about Twitter, but we don't know about all these other ones. So, yeah, I mean, we can't. I think to think about doing that is to sort of dissolve the difficult into the impossible, and we need to think about things that could be tackled.
Yeah, and there are lots of other countries where social media are much more fragmented, and these problems don't look better. I agree completely with almost everything you said. I think it is absolutely right that social media were not designed for this purpose, and they therefore, but they incidentally happen to not work very well for this purpose. That's fundamental to this. I also completely agree with you that the kind of news organizations that we have had in the past have much stronger incentives to invest in checking the validity of what they're saying and being careful and vetting things and fact-checking and all of that. What I would disagree with is that has been because of regulation. I think in the US at least, there has never been a law in the US that tells, say, the New York Times or a newspaper that they need to print true things. The New York Times could print false things tomorrow and would be in violation of no law or no regulation as long as it wasn't like defamation or something like that. The reason that they have over hundreds of years invested in doing that is because they made more money if people trusted them. And they that has been a powerful incentive in the past. And for the reasons that we were talking about, that incentive really breaks down on social media, where those producing the content are not facing that kind of reputational cost. And Facebook as a platform does internalize that to some extent, but it's so big and so vast that they can't, even just in a feasibility sense, there's no way that they can vet everything that's being passed around.
So could I just add one thing to that? I mean, one area which we haven't really mentioned, but I think is pretty important, is the fact that Facebook's efforts in this direction are really geared to English-speaking or languages that are widely spoken and big, strong states. And when it comes to weak states with languages that very few people speak, none of this is happening. Any of the kind of good things any of us have mentioned are not happening at all. And I think that is something to really worry about. We've got very different, social media environments in different countries. And that is something I think we ought to be lobbying platforms on, because they're not talking about regulation in those countries.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sveta Ivanova, Gentzkow, Technical University, Berlin. So you mentioned before young generation. So sorry. I was wondering whether it might be also a promising path if we start to improve the media literacy of the young generation, to try to teach them to distinguish or to differentiate between different news, or how they can critically deal with such news, and similar to the financial literacy that one tried to improve after the financial crisis. Is there some attempt in this direction? Could it be something that is worth of thinking?
Well, I think that's a really good point. I mean, and I think it should always have been taught in schools. I mean, so that's not something new. I mean, the news environment in the UK is distinct, and the kind of the traditional print press, much of it has a very bad reputation. So I think that should always have been the case, and I think it should be the case now. I mean, when it comes to kind of literacy in terms of the platforms and what's right and what's not, etc., there will be things that they could teach us, actually, in terms of navigating this environment. And I do think that young people are actually much more skeptical about some kinds of so-called fake news than perhaps older generations. But in terms of actual media literacy and thinking where information comes from, and the whole idea of sources, which is, as Matt, I think, said, on social media, and young people especially, if you ask young people where things come from, it horrifies me when my son says, "Oh, I read this," and it's like, yeah, it has no idea where it came from. I mean, I find that very frightening. So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's got to take place at all levels.
There was a great paper published in Science recently showing that if you look at the crazy misinformation stuff, the fake news, you were like many, many times more likely to share such stories in the run-up to the election if you're over 65. And that there's like an enormous age gradient in that the shares of that kind of really crazy content are like overwhelmingly pushed toward older demographics, which doesn't mean if you look at the way young people consume news, it's some model of tremendous critical sophistication, but there is some inherent, digital native being better at these things, and certainly there's scope for, a lot of people are working on this problem, and I don't know, I think it's hard to move the needle a lot quickly with digital literacy, but I think in the long run, that's certainly part of the solution.
Well, one last important aspect that I think we haven't touched upon, but I think I want to throw it into the discussion because it's really important to me, is that we often forget that even though Facebook, Twitter, Google are US-based companies, they're actually global companies, and I think Helen mentioned that they're also the content is being distributed in many languages. But the problem is that if we start to, at the moment, the discussion about regulation is mostly about national level reinforcement of regulation. So if we end up having stronger regulations, at least in Europe and many other countries in the world, we may end up with national versions of the internet, which really goes against the idea of digital technology to start with. So I think we have collected a lot of issues, a lot of food for thought, both in terms of new empirical studies that we need to, and relationships we need to explore, but also in terms of how to tackle these problems. I want to thank you all for raising great questions, great points, and I want to thank the speakers for sharing their insights. Thank you so much.